Welcome back to Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I'm Jack Llewellyn. Thank you for joining me. In the U.S. here, it is Memorial Day weekend, so I hope everyone is having a nice and safe long weekend. Hope you have better weather than we've had in Colorado, but in any event, hope it's a great weekend for everyone. Sometimes in doing these podcasts and the newsletter that goes with them, there's actually not much going on. So sometimes it's really hard to figure out what is the right topic for the week. That, my friends, is not the case these days. In fact, so much news has been coming out that I've had this episode rewritten, and I don't actually write them out. I think it's probably pretty obvious. I outline them, but things have continually changed, and so I get ready to do it. And I got to wait another day because I got to put this in, or talk about this, or think about this. So we're going to do the best we can to catch up a little bit today. Keep in mind just what I said. It may well be that some news comes out tomorrow morning that slightly contradicts or adds to what we're going to talk about today. That's just part of the process. And as I'll say a little bit as we go through this, a couple of important topics coming up in the next couple of weeks that follow along. So before we get to that, I want to talk about some of the big news events over the last couple of days, or things that have happened with me in the last few days, and give you an idea of where we're going to be going, but not the central point of the podcast episode today. So number one, over the weekend, Jorge Humberto Figueroa, also known as El Peri or L27, was killed in Navolato. He is considered to have been the head of security for Ivan, or one of the heads of security for Los Chapitos. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to tell exactly what the position is, but in any event, very important within security for Ivan and Los Chapitos. If you're keeping track at home, that's at least 3 heads of security for Ivan and Los Chapitos who have been captured or killed in the last several months. Again, you will hear lots of people talking about how this could be, the death knell for Ivan, or how much more it puts Ivan at risk. I'll only note, as I have said many times before, that we've seen those headlines in the past, right? El Nini and others are, all right, well, this is going to be terrible for Ivan, terrible for Los Chapitos, and yet they're still here. I want to tell you about something that I did over the last 2 months that is very important to me. And those of you who listen on a regular basis will know why I'm bringing this up. So the Rocky Mountain Field Division of the DEA held for a 7-week period its first ever Citizens Academy. About 20, 25 of us participated, and it was a real deep dive, in-depth look at the DEA, including a lot of practical things. We did a whole day of field exercises that I unfortunately missed, but we did fake busts, like a drug bust. And when I say fake, man, it was like a movie, and you're in it. And cars are coming in and screeching, and sirens are going, and people are holding very, very real-looking fake guns. And it was amazing. And we had classroom time, and we were able to learn an awful lot about the DEA. And over the last few weeks, I've said, hey, I had some information about X or Y. Can't tell you where it was from yet, but I'm now allowed to tell you a lot of that came from the DEA during this Citizens Academy. They just wanted me to wait until the academy was completed to talk about it. If we get a chance in the next few weeks, I will come back to this. It was an amazing experience. very, very thankful to the special agent in charge, Jonathan Pullen, and to the public information officer, Stephen Tubbs, who's a friend, for allowing me to participate. It was a lot of fun. I'll also note we did go to a shooting range and shot rifle and pistol, and no injuries. I think the people in my office had the over-under at about 3, but no injuries, and I even hit the target. So I was pretty impressed with myself. But having said that, lots of great information, lots of insight, an opportunity to talk to DEA agents and current agents in a slightly different way than I have in the past. So I think it's very, very helpful for me in trying to communicate at various times what the DEA is trying to do and their objectives and the like. Next thing, last week, the DEA came out with its 2025 National Drug Threat Assessment. You may have seen a few features from that in the news, in particular, the kind of stunning decrease in fentanyl deaths in the last year. We will take a deep dive into the threat assessment report in the next couple of weeks. It's a long report. Some of it is applicable here, some of it isn't. But as I've said in the past, I'll read it so you don't have to, and we'll talk about the important parts. Then last week, I listened to a webcast from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data. That's their name. Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, ACLED, which I'm reading from its website, is a disaggregated data collection, analysis, and crisis mapping initiative. ACLED collects information on the dates, actors, locations, fatalities, and types of all reported political violence and protest events around the world. The ACLED team conducts analysis to describe and explore conflict trends. And the program that they put on last week was called How the Sinaloa Cartel Rift is Redrawing Mexico's Criminal Map. And I'm going to read you just a little bit and then discuss it for a second. But one of the things that they say in this analysis is the fallout of the Sinaloa cartel dispute has set off a broader realignment of criminal groups and openings for new conflicts in contested territories. To understand the significance of the Sinaloa cartel's rift and its impact on gang violence dynamics, it is necessary to understand how it came to garner such influence and how its internal structure has enabled its expansion across the country. What was fascinating about this, and we're going to go into it in great detail in the next week or two as well. You know, the plural of anecdote isn't data. And so much of the information we gain in trying to understand the cartels and cartel activities is anecdotal. Right? There's very little data. And one of the problems with data is data sometimes lags behind the anecdotes and sometimes lags behind the action because things have to happen. Then you collect the data, then you analyze the data, and then you say what your analysis is, all the while things are still going on. But what this program did and the information they put together was to provide significant facts, significant data analysis to bolster and support, or in some cases to question the narrative that flows from this anecdotal evidence, right? So very interesting. I think you'll be surprised by some of the results. And this organization, that was the first time I'd seen anything from them. The two main speakers from this group were very, very interesting. And I think you'll find it fascinating when we talk about it. Last thing to note, and these all kind of flow together and then flow into what we want to talk about as the main topic for today. The rumored alliance between Los Chapitos and CJNG appears to have been confirmed by video evidence, by some additional social media type evidence, some news or some propaganda put out by both Los Chapitos and CJNG. And at least one news report I saw this morning says, yep, the DEA is confirming that this alliance exists, and they are interested in seeing exactly what it holds. Obviously, that's going to be a huge topic of conversation in weeks to come. We're not talking about it today only because I want to put a little bit of time behind it. Let's see how it plays out for the next couple of days and see what information comes out, especially since we're in the middle of the weekend. So instead, what I want to do is take us back about 2 weeks or a little bit less. And we had the highly unusual event of about 19 members of El Chapo's family walking across the border, walking into the United States and being greeted by government officials and taken into, I'll call it custody, not in a negative way, but taken into custody by the American officials. So what we want to know is what happened and why, and what does it mean? In order to talk about that, I want to go back and just remind everyone of a couple of key facts with respect to Los Chapitos, Ovidio and Joaquin in particular. So if you remember, Los Chapitos, more or less, is 4 of El Chapo's sons. But there's 2 sets of half-brothers, right? So you have the Guzman Lopez brothers, which is Ovidio and Joaquin. And then you have the Guzman Salazar brothers, Jesus Alfredo, Ivan Archivaldo. Now, immediately, you see something interesting about the 2 sets of brothers. One set of brothers is in jail in the United States. The other set is in Mexico and now are Los Chapitos. Also want to remind you about Ovidio. Ovidio was captured on January 5th, 2023, and we talked about that, and we talked about him going back, probably having been in a position to escape, having gone back because one of his daughters was having a panic attack with all the helicopters with guns and stuff coming in. But in any event, he was captured January 5, 2023. 8 months later, September 15, 2023, he was extradited to the United States. Fast forward a little less than a year, and on July 25, 2024, we have Joaquin and El Mayo flying into the United States. And we've talked extensively about that and how El Mayo got on the plane or was put on the plane and what all that means. But what is important is as of July 25-ish of 2024, both Joaquin and Ovidio were in American, in custody in the United States. And Joaquin apparently had gone there voluntarily. So, with all that in mind, let's fast forward to what's starting to happen, or what happened. One of the things that started to come out over the last few months were significant rumors that both Joaquin and Ovidio had been providing what we'll call valuable information to prosecutors and to investigators. In particular, those rumors talked a lot about giving information about El Mayo and the El Mayo structure and criminal enterprise, those sorts of things. There were discussions or rumors and talks that one or both of the brothers may have had some video evidence of payments and drop-offs and locations and things of that nature. We also had information, including from Annabelle Hernandez, and I can't tell you the exact timing, if this was before or after the family members crossed the border, but Annabelle Hernandez has said that both Joaquin and Ovidio were, let's say, they were more strategic in their negotiations with the government than their father had been. So the idea is that El Chapo had at various times said, hey, I got lots of information, I'll tell you, but you got to drop all the charges against my kids and other things, probably including, and I don't have to stay in Supermax anymore. Those never really went anywhere. Query whether they ever could. I don't know how much you could really see the government making a significant plea deal with somebody like El Chapo. Nevertheless, the idea was, even if they were willing to entertain something, he either didn't have enough information that was valuable to them and not already known, or he just was asking for too much in return. The idea here is that Ovidio and Joaquin have been more strategic, whether that's because they learned from their father's mistakes, whether they're getting guidance from their father or their father's attorneys. And remember, the attorneys are fairly ubiquitous in these situations, or not, so how that's all playing out, I'm not sure. But what we do know is the government came out a couple weeks ago and said, hey, I know we were going to have a status report or status hearing. We don't need to do that. Ovidio is going to take a plea, and we're working on the negotiations of the plea agreement. The court then set a new date for, I believe, July 9th, 2025, where the plea will be entered into court. So we got these stories coming out. Ovidio and Joaquin are giving valuable information. Ovidio has said, I'm going to plead guilty, at least through the mouths of the prosecutors. And then you had 17 relatives of El Chapo who walked from Tijuana into San Diego and again were taken into custody is a bad word because that sounds negative, but were received there by officials of the U.S. government. Among the relatives of El Chapo, according to Mexican media accounts, were his ex-wife, a daughter, a son-in-law, a grandson, and nephews and nieces. The the first journalist report from Mexico, and one or two journalists in Mexico really got a huge scoop on this, did a phenomenal job. But the way they describe it is U.S. agents met them on the San Diego side and whisked them away. The transfer of the El Chapo relatives into San Diego, or the movement into San Diego, was later confirmed by Mexico's security chief, Omar Garcia Harfuch. But interestingly enough, he said the Mexican government was not notified that this was going to happen in advance. In fact, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum later complained that the operation had gone on with no notice from any U.S. authorities, and that she thought that that was kind of injurious to the relationship between the two countries. Harfouche also told reporters that it looked clear to Mexican authorities that the Department of Justice in the U.S. had granted the family members entry as part of a deal with Ovidio, which kind of is what people had assumed. The reports have gone on to say that, however, until the Trump administration confirms a deal occurred and the details of the deal, or there are public records verifying the deal, everybody's a little bit unsure. And as of the present, the Department of Justice has acknowledged working with Ovidio and has acknowledged this plea agreement that Ovidio is going to enter into. But they haven't really indicated that that was the reason for these relatives of El Chapo coming into the United States or the terms of that. Moreover, it's unclear exactly where they are presently, or if they're in protective custody, or if they're receiving other benefits from the U.S. As I said, the main scoop came from Luis Chaparro, who's a Mexican journalist, specializes in stories about Mexico and the cartels. He has a website, and he has a blog type of thing. And so he's, kind of a valuable source. He was the one who really saw or broke the story, had pictures of members of the family, in Tijuana waiting to cross over. Those came up on pretty fast. And his reporting was a couple of things that are important. One is that the representatives of the government who were there to, as I said, whisk away the family was actually the FBI, and that the family, quote unquote, surrendered to the FBI at the San Ysidro border port in Tijuana. Among those who were in that group going over, in addition to the information I just gave you, was Griselda Lopez, and that's Ovidio's mother. Also a grandson named Archivaldo, and a daughter of El Chapo's, along with her husband, so the son-in-law. The family, this again is still according to Luis Chaparro, the family apparently arrived at the border crossing with several suitcases, at least 2 suitcases for each member. And between them all, they were said to be carrying more than $70,000 in cash. There were a few follow-ups, and as I said, the U.S. government has not yet really explained the reasons for the operation to move the family across the border. And one of the speculations in the Mexican press has been that some of these family members could enter into cooperation agreements themselves. They could provide information, etc. In addition, one of the fears for the family had been that if it becomes known, as it is, that Ovidio and Joaquin are providing valuable information to the DEA and other agencies and implicating cartel members in Mexico, that these family members themselves were under direct threat, right? Their lives were in jeopardy. And in that light, it makes sense for the U.S. government to take them in and provide some type of protection for them, whether that's, technical witness protection or however else it may be structured. Not surprisingly, there was a little bit of opposition to this. Senate Democrat leader Chuck Schumer said it was a, quote, total disgrace that these 17 relatives were allowed in. He said, quote, Donald Trump and the Republicans love to talk tough about how they're tough on the border and tough on border security. So you can imagine our surprise to read that President Trump is making deals with drug cartels to come into our country. Now, here's where the family dynamics get a little bit interesting. Another Mexican journalist in the publication Zeta Tijuana said that Ovidio and Joaquin have broken relations with their half-brothers, Ivan and Jesus. You would think that came kind of, as once you started talking in the U.S., once Joaquin, did his thing, it took a mile into the United States, that might cause a rift between the brothers. But what this journalist and this publication is saying is Ovidio and Joaquin has seen that in this war between La Maíza and Los Chapitos, that Chapitos are surrendering or losing control of a lot of territory. And for lack of a better word, maybe Alfredo and Joaquin, or Alfredo, one more time, Ovidio and Joaquin have, decided which side to be on. If their brothers had been winning this battle, would they have continued to do it? Not sure. In the publication Zeta Tijuana, a State Department source was quoted who said that the separation between the Guzman Lopez brothers and Guzman Salazar occurred after the perception that Los Chapitos were losing the internal war in Sinaloa, especially in the face of the push of La Maíza, as the faction led by Ishmael Zambada Sicarios and El Maído Flaco is popularly known. According to this version, the Guzman Lopez family chose to break the family alliance after their half-brothers lost operational strength and support from key cells, so it was decided to immediately remove relatives of El Raton, the name of Ovidio. A couple of other things. Trying to put this all together. Remember where we started with the news of the last couple of weeks. In the National Threat Assessment from the DEA, it came out this month, that report warns that the current division between Los Chapitos and Los Mayos or La Maíza has been capitalized on by CJNG, right? And we've talked about that a dozen times. And it notes that CJNG maintains a presence in much of the country's territory and has established tactical alliances with Los Chapitos in some regions. So, drug threat assessment from the DEA says CJNG is growing. We'll talk about the specifics of that and their growth and their breadth, and also notes that there are some tactical alliances with Chapitos in some regions, right? And we've talked about those in the past, right? Certain kind of more regionalized or local alliances between the two groups. The threat assessment report also says, although the possible alliance has not yet been concretely verified on the ground, unofficial reports indicate that temporary cooperation agreements have been discussed in strategic areas to stop the advance of Los Mayos. The DEA warns that this criminal configuration could lead to greater territorial expansion, increased flow of fentanyl into the United States, and an increase in violence. So if you look at in that context, the fissure of the Guzman Lopez brothers from the Guzman Salazar brothers and the cooperation and collaboration that apparently is happening with Ovidio and Joaquin and the Department of Justice and the investigative agencies could really be a key turning point in the history of Mexican cartels. And that's where I go back to that report or the webinar from the ACLED. And you start, and again, we're going to go through this next week, but if you start looking at the data that lags the analysis, the data that lags a little bit of the anecdotal evidence and even greater evidence than that on the streets. But if you take that data and you then take what we know is happening now, you add into that the movement of these relatives of El Chapo into the United States, and you may for the first time, we've talked about this before. How many people saying, end of CDS, the end of the Sinaloa cartel? But we may now be at a point where we can say the Sinaloa cartel may exist, but it does not exist in any form that it previously existed in, and it never will. It's never going back to that alliance between El Chapo's family, both sides, and El Mayo, and then the other, factions of it. One of the things I also want to note is the idea, there's a lot of thought that there may be more. So we know that Ovidio, right, is going to plead guilty. Look for Joaquin to be doing something similar and query whether that means that other members of the family may be going into the United States, very similar to the ones that just did. Also, a number of rumors that, well, before we say that, let's go back. Remember we talked a few weeks or a month or two ago about the idea that the move by Joaquin to fly El Mayo in was part of a detailed plan that El Chapo had come up with a long time ago, and part of El Chapo's thought of trying to encourage his sons to surrender and give up and move on. And one of the things that we talked about too was the fact that both Ovidio and Joaquin had families. Ovidio, as I said earlier, he went back, allowed himself to be captured in order to make sure that his daughter was okay. There are stories that Joaquin's wife has no real ties to the cartel life or cartel families, has no interest in that and wanted him to get out of it. Well, there are some rumors now that if things continue as they are, the next one that you could see going to the United States might be Jesus Alfredo himself. Remember when we talked about that in the past, about the ideas from El Chapo? At one point, El Chapo and Amayo has sat down with all of their kids and said, this is what you should do. You should get out of this life while you can, et cetera, et cetera. And the stories coming out of that were that it was Yvonne who said, oh, hell no. In particular, it was Yvonne. When you talk about Los Chapitos over the last few years, everyone clearly had a role or has a role, but by far the dominant force in that group, at least looking from the outside, is Yvonne. And when we talk about the alliance between CJNG and Los Chapitos, it's talked about most frequently as being someone from or an alliance with El Mencho and Yvonne. And who's not mentioned nearly as much? Alfredito. So query whether at some point Alfredito starts looking around saying, holy hell, we're losing. Yvonne now has this alliance with CJNG, and we'll see how that develops. I'm maybe on the outside looking in, or at a minimum, I don't know what my position is going to be in this new alliance. Perhaps it would be best if I do the same thing that Ovidio and Joaquin did. I surrender and make the best deal I possibly can. At least then, I have some degree of certainty. And we've talked in the past about how, this is commonplace almost. Not necessarily at this level, but, the people who turn themselves in. We listed dozens of people who've done that and gotten good deals. So maybe that's what's coming up next. Pulling this all together, what I think is important to note is, so we saw the news reports, right? 19 members of El Chapo's family cross into San Diego and are taken into custody by the FBI. That in and of itself is interesting. But what it says about what's going on, what it says about the internal war between La Maíz and Los Chapitos, what it says about the familiar relations between Guzman Lopez and Guzman Salazar, what it says about the relationship between Yvonne and CJNG, particularly in light of the reports this week that we talked about, that's far more interesting. So next week, what we're going to do is we're going to take this information and we're going to combine it by looking at the National Drug Threat Assessment from the DEA and that report on how the Sinaloa cartel rift is redrawing Mexico's criminal map. We're going to do that in light of some information that has come out, as we've talked about, since the podcast or the webinar. The webinar was on May 7th. Actually, the webinar is a little bit later, but the information was posted on the ACLD LED website on May 7th. And dramatic things have happened since then. And we're going to be able to analyze those and say what it means and looking forward. Okay, that was a boatload of information. I hope I gave it to you in a way that makes sense and was interesting. I've said 1,000 times that in a purely academic sense, I find all of this completely fascinating. And I think we're seeing history being made in the ways that the cartels are going to be changing. And it'll be fascinating to keep watching not only what happens between La Maíza and Los Chapitos, but how that really, in fact, affects CJNG and the rise and proliferation of new splinter groups. I swear I hear of a new quote-unquote cartel every day. If you listen to this and things didn't make sense, please let me know and I can go back and try and correct them or add to them or whatever the case may be. So with that, I will let you go. Have a great rest of your long weekend, and I will see you next week back here on Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. Thanks, everyone.